morning, Christ Central. Today we have a reading from Nehemiah for you, which is Nehemiah 2, 1-8. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This could be nothing but sadness of heart." I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" And the king said to me, "What do you want?" And then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judea where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." And then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you be back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, "If it pleases the king, may I have safe conduct to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. May I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so that he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy." And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request. So today, I thought I'd give you a bit of background to Nehemiah and his story. And it starts in the court of the Persian king. And Persia is the land that we now know as Iran. And if you meet someone today who comes from there and is no fan of the current regime, they may say that they're Persian and get a little cross if you say they might be Iranian. And the Persian Empire is created by Cyrus the Great, who was king of a middle-sized nation and a phenomenally successful general who conquered the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So then he found himself ruling not only Iran, but Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Turkey. All the countries that now are those things. And his successors even tried to conquer Greece, and they failed despite having a much larger army. But you may have heard of things like the Battle of Marathon, where a messenger runs 26 miles and then drops dead, or Salamis, where the Greeks defeated a much larger Persian navy. Now, the Persians are Zoroastrians. They are followers of the prophet Zoroaster, who believe in one God, called Ahura Mazda, the Wide Lord, and they also believe in a coming Messiah, judgment after death, and heaven and hell. Very, very ancient religion. Zoroaster probably lived around 1000 BC, but they are still around today, even though they're quite rare. There is a Zoroastrian community meeting in a converted Art Deco cinema in Harrow, and the most famous recent Zoroastrian was none other than Freddie Mercury. So, very interesting question people ask is, how influential was Zoroastrianism on the development of Judaism, given that there are these ideas like heaven and hell and the idea of a Messiah, which seem to come fairly late into Judaism? The great devolvers are multiculturalists. There's 4 capital cities. The empire is divided into areas, each with a governor called a satrap. And these satraps are allowed a good deal of autonomy just to get on with things. And there's a remarkable degree of religious toleration. You can believe almost what you like in the Persian Empire. So the Jews are allowed to carry on with their religion, with their lives, and they're allowed to go back from Babylon, where they had been bought by the Assyrians, and go back and live in Jerusalem again. So the way Nehemiah is being allowed to go back and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, spoiler alert, he gets to do this, is not special treatment that the Jews are getting. It's just the standard Persian imperial policy of doing business, which is very much let the peoples that live in all the different places get on with their lives. Very different from the Assyrians who came before. Now, it's pretty much universally by biblical scholars that Nehemiah is a genuine memoir from a 5th century Jewish official. Now, that may sound obvious to you, given the way it reads, but it's pretty remarkable for scholars to agree about something like that. It's very unusual for biblical scholars to agree on everything. So, and their job is to question received wisdom. So this makes Nehemiah very different from most of the history books of the Jewish Bible, which were probably put together in the form we now have them during the Babylonian exile, centuries or even millennia after the events recounted. But though it's based on a memoir of someone who was there at the time, it has been edited, and it may be some bits of artistic license have crept in. And some scholars think that the passage we have just read is one of those embellishments. This is because from what we know of Persian kings, they were fantastically remote. We get most of our knowledge about the Persian court from the ancient Greeks, writers like Xenophon. Greeks very, very interested in Persians because the Persians kept on invading them. And they found the Persian court fascinating because to them, it was really, really weird. According to Greek sources, the king lived largely in seclusion and prided himself on his inaccessible. He's surrounded by ritual and protocol. So in that sort of context, the idea of a Persian king who would be interested in a lowly official and give a monkeys about how he was feeling sad sounds a bit unlikely. Empathy and concern from the subjects wasn't really a Persian king type thing. But the Greeks are looking at the Persian court from the outside, and it's possible that life at court was a bit more human on the inside. And if Nehemiah was a personal servant of the king, his wine taster, the person who gets to taste the wine first to make sure it's not poisoned, a tough gig. And if your wine taster looked at you and was looking a bit off colour, the king probably would take notice of that and ask you if you were feeling okay, even only out of self-interest. But what can this passage mean for us today? It makes me think about our projects and plans and how they relate to God's will. Nehemiah thinks that God is with him and that God has been messing with the mind of the king to allow him to undertake this great project, which Nehemiah is convinced that God wants him to achieve. And this raises so many questions. How do you know whether what you want to undertake really is God's will? And if it's God's will it somehow succeed? Now, I think we have to remember that this is memoir. Nehemiah is looking back after the events. He's built his whopping great wall. Jerusalem has been repopulated. He's writing about it. So looking back, it seems very clear that God was with him and helped bring it all about. But I wonder if it seemed so at the time. Events at the time seemed like a good outcome and may look like a good thing 5 years later, may not appear so good 10 years or 15 years later. Things change as our perspective changes and we look back. So when it comes to working out what God's will is and whether he's supportive of a particular project, maybe it's best not to worry about whether it's God's plan or if it's will, and think, does it fit best with how does it fit with God's kingdom priorities? Does it result in more love of God and God being more glorified? Does it connect with people and serve them and meet their needs? Because I think it's really important to ask God who wants and listen to answer about the way forward. You may be waiting a very, very long time and life may pass you by. Maybe we should not be too focused and look at his big wall and you can think, result, I got the result I wanted. I got you with me. Skippered a Christian cell training yacht called Morning Star, and it was built by a guy named Tim, and he was like Noah. He wanted to take people sailing, and he built the biggest boat he could. And when asked why, all he says is, I felt it was something that God would have me do. And God has worked in many people and in many ways through that boat and the organization that's built around it. And it continues to do so, even though the boat has retired after 40 years hard work. And in retrospect, I think having this very vague, I think this is what God would have me do, rather than very highly defined criteria of success. And it's only, God's only in this, if this thing has happened that I've set the parameters for, I think has been a good thing. I think having a very flexible vision has allowed the organization, the people in it, to adapt to changing times. And although there have been many times when I've felt that we needed a firmer vision and clearer goals, something more results-based, looking back, I think I was probably wrong about that. And that is all I have for you today.